My name is Eleanor Hartley. I am 37 years old, a solicitor based in Bristol, and the only person in my family who was never invited to a single reading of my grandfather's estate documents. For 15 years, my Aunt Margaret and my cousins treated those papers like a secret that belonged to them and only them. They whispered in hallways, they excused themselves from rooms when certain names came up, and they smiled at me with that particular kind of smile that people give someone they believe knows nothing. I was the quiet one. The one who moved away. The one who married a man they considered beneath our family name and built a small, ordinary life far from the grand house in Gloucestershire where I grew up. I was easy to overlook. I was easy to dismiss. What none of them ever thought to ask, not once in 15 years, was what I actually did for a living. They knew I worked in law. They simply never asked which kind. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. It was cream-colored, thick, formal, and it had my full name printed on the front in the kind of typeface that only one firm in the county still uses. I stood at my kitchen counter, still in my coat, and I read the letter inside twice. Then I set it down, made a cup of tea, and sat very quietly for a long time. Because I had been waiting for this letter for 3 years. And now that it had finally arrived, everything was about to change. To understand what that letter meant, you need to understand what my grandfather was. Arthur Hartley was not a warm man. He was precise, deliberate, and extraordinarily careful with everything he owned, his words, his money, his trust. He had built a construction company from nothing in the 1960s, turned it into something worth considerable money by the time I was born, and spent the last decades of his life watching very carefully how every person around him behaved. He had 6 grandchildren. I was the second oldest. My cousin Daniel was the favorite, or at least that was what everyone believed, because Daniel was loud and charming and always present at every family dinner, always laughing at grandfather's jokes, always offering to help with the garden or the car or whatever needed doing that weekend. I was quieter. I asked questions instead of performing. When I was 19 and visiting for Christmas, I sat with grandfather for 2 hours while everyone else watched television, and I asked him about the company, about how he had built it, about what he had learned. He listened to me differently after that. I did not know it then, but I understand it now. He was not looking for charm. He was looking for someone who paid attention. When I qualified as a solicitor 8 years later and told him at a family lunch, the table moved on within 30 seconds. Daniel made a joke and everyone laughed and grandfather said nothing. But that evening he called me into his study, closed the door, and said 4 words I never forgot. I see you, Eleanor. I did not fully understand what he meant until the year he died. Grandfather died on a Tuesday in November, 3 years ago. He was 81 years old, sharp until the very last week, and he went quietly in his own bed in the Gloucestershire house with the sound of the garden outside his window. I was in Bristol when my mother called. I drove up that evening and sat with the family in the front room while Aunt Margaret made tea and organized things the way she always organized things, efficiently, authoritatively, as though grief were a project that needed managing. Margaret was my grandfather's eldest child, my mother's older sister, and she had spent 40 years positioning herself as the natural head of the family. She controlled the calendar, the Christmas arrangements, the decisions about who sat where and who was told what. When grandfather was alive she deferred to him publicly and undermined him privately. I had watched her do it for years. The night he died she was already moving. I saw it in the way she collected certain papers from his desk before anyone else entered the study. I saw it in the quiet conversation she had with her son Daniel in the hallway, voices low, eyes checking the door. I said nothing. I stood by the window with my cup of tea and I watched and I filed everything away in the part of my mind that had been trained for exactly this. Because 3 months before grandfather died, he had called me to his house alone, on a Wednesday afternoon in August, while the rest of the family was at Daniel's barbecue 2 villages over. He had asked me to sit down across from his desk. He had slid a sealed envelope across the surface toward me. And he had said, I need you to hold this until the right moment comes. I need someone I trust completely. I kept that envelope in the fireproof safe in my home office for 3 months. I did not open it. I did not tell my husband James what was inside, only that it was something important that needed protecting. James is not a man who asks unnecessary questions. He made sure the safe was locked and he never mentioned it again. That is one of the many reasons I married him. In those 3 months before grandfather died, I watched the family with new eyes. I attended the Sunday lunches and the birthday gatherings, and I listened to the conversations that happened just loudly enough for me to hear. Margaret had already begun talking about the house. Not directly, not obviously, but in the way that certain people telegraph their intentions through careful language. She mentioned the upkeep costs. She mentioned how difficult it would be to manage the estate without proper guidance. She mentioned that Daniel had always had such a strong connection to the property. She was building a narrative. She was laying foundations the way my grandfather had once laid the foundations of his company, brick by brick, quietly, before anyone noticed the structure taking shape. What she did not know was that I had already read the documents grandfather had filed with his primary solicitor 18 months before his death. Not because I had gone looking for them. Because the primary solicitor was a man named Gerald Whitmore, and Gerald Whitmore was the senior partner at the firm where I had completed my training contract 11 years earlier. Gerald had called me himself. He had said simply, "Your grandfather came to see me today and he asked me to make sure you were informed of your role." Your role, Eleanor. Those 2 words changed everything that came after. My role was this. I was the sole executor of my grandfather's estate. Not Margaret. Not Daniel. Not any of the cousins who had spent years positioning themselves around that house like pieces on a chessboard. Me. The quiet one. The one who had moved away. The one they smiled at with that particular smile. Gerald had walked me through the documents carefully over 2 separate meetings in his office, both times on weekday afternoons when I told my family I was attending a legal conference. The will was detailed, precise, and written in the kind of language that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Grandfather had been thorough in the way he was thorough about everything. Every asset was accounted for. Every instruction was clear. And the distribution of those assets was not what Margaret had been quietly promising her children for the better part of a decade. I sat across from Gerald in his office on that second meeting and I read every page twice. Then I looked up and I asked him one question. Does anyone else know the contents? He folded his hands on the desk and he said, "Your grandfather was very specific that the contents remain known only to him, to me, and to you until the formal reading." He paused. He did say one other thing. He said that if anyone in the family attempts to produce an alternative document before the formal reading, you will know what to do. I drove home from that meeting and I sat in my car outside my house for 20 minutes before going inside. Because I understood then what grandfather had seen that Christmas when I was 19. He had not been looking for the loudest person in the room. He had been looking for the one who would still be standing when everything else fell apart. And he had chosen me 3 years before he died, which meant he had known something was coming long before the rest of us did. The formal reading was scheduled for 6 weeks after grandfather's funeral. 6 weeks is a long time when a family is circling an estate worth what ours was worth. The house in Gloucestershire alone sat on 4 acres and had been valued at £2.3 million the previous year. There was also the investment portfolio, the proceeds from the partial sale of the construction company a decade earlier, and a collection of commercial properties in Bristol and Bath that grandfather had quietly accumulated over 30 years and never once discussed at a family dinner. The total estate, when Gerald had shown me the full picture, was just over £6 million. I had sat very still when I read that number. Not because it surprised me exactly, but because it made everything that happened next make complete sense. £6 million is enough to make people behave in ways that would otherwise be unthinkable. In those 6 weeks between the funeral and the reading, Margaret moved quickly. She had the locks on the Gloucestershire house changed within 10 days, citing security concerns. She arranged for certain items of furniture and several paintings to be moved to Daniel's property for what she called safekeeping. She hosted a family dinner at the house 3 weeks after the funeral to which I was not invited. I found out about it through my cousin Rachel, who was there and who sent me a message afterward that said simply, "Eleanor, you need to know they're talking about a document." A document. I read Rachel's message standing in my kitchen on a Sunday evening and I felt something settle in my chest, cold and certain. I had been waiting for this. Gerald had warned me it might come. I picked up my phone and I called him. He answered on the second ring. "I know," he said before I had spoken a word. "I received a call this afternoon. Someone has instructed a separate firm to prepare a codicil." I asked him how long we had. He said, 6 weeks just became 4. A codicil is an amendment to a will. In legitimate circumstances it is a straightforward legal document, an addition or alteration made by the original testator while they are still living, properly witnessed, properly dated, properly filed. What Margaret was attempting to produce was none of those things because my grandfather had been dead for 3 weeks. Whatever document her chosen firm was preparing, it had not been signed by Arthur Hartley. It could not have been. Which meant someone was either forging his signature or attempting to pass off an older undated document as a recent amendment. Either way it was fraud. I sat with that word for a full evening before I allowed myself to act on it. Fraud is not a word a solicitor uses lightly. It is not an accusation you make against your own family at a kitchen table on a Sunday night without being absolutely certain of what you are dealing with. I called Gerald again the following morning and I asked him to begin the process of moving the formal reading forward. I also made 2 other calls. The first was to a colleague of mine named Patrick O'Say who specialized in contested estates and had spent 15 years handling exactly these situations. Patrick listened without interrupting while I explained everything. When I finished he said, "Send me the documents tonight and I will be in Gerald's office by Wednesday." The second call was harder. It was to my mother. She was the only person in the family outside of Gerald and James who I trusted with any of this, and even then I told her only what she needed to know. I said, "Mum, I need you to attend the reading and I need you to say nothing to Margaret beforehand." Not a word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." She said, "Your grandfather always said you were the sharpest one." I had never heard her say that before. I wrote it down after I hung up because I wanted to remember it exactly. The reading was moved to a Thursday morning in Gerald's office in the center of Bristol. A formal conference room on the 4th floor, long table, tall windows, the kind of room that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations and gave nothing back. Gerald had sent the notification letters to all named parties 4 days in advance, which was the minimum required period and deliberate. Margaret called Gerald's office twice after receiving her letter. His assistant noted both calls and their content. The first call Margaret asked whether the date could be moved to accommodate Daniel's schedule. Gerald's assistant said the date was fixed. The second call Margaret asked whether all parties were required to attend in person. Gerald's assistant said yes. I arrived 20 minutes early. Patrick was already there, seated to Gerald's left with a leather folder in front of him, calm and unhurried the way experienced lawyers are calm when they already know how the day ends. James had driven me and was waiting in a coffee shop around the corner. I had asked him not to come inside. This was not his battle to witness. It was mine. My mother arrived 12 minutes before the hour, sat beside me, and squeezed my hand once without speaking. Margaret and Daniel arrived together at 1 minute past the hour, which I noted was itself a statement, a small performance of indifference to the formality of the occasion. Margaret was dressed as though attending a board meeting. Daniel wore a jacket over an open collar, the studied casualness of a man who expects good news and wants to appear relaxed about it. 2 of my other cousins filed in behind them. Rachel sat as far from Daniel as the table allowed and did not look at Margaret once. Then everyone was seated and Gerald opened his folder and the room went very quiet and 15 years of silence was about to end. Gerald began in the manner of a man who had done this hundreds of times and understood that the weight of the moment required no theatrical addition from him. He stated the date, the name of the deceased, the title of the document, and confirmed that all named parties were present. Then he looked up once around the table and said, "Before I proceed to the reading I am required to address a preliminary matter." Margaret's expression did not change, but I saw her fingers tighten around the leather strap of her bag beneath the table. Gerald continued. "It has come to my attention that in the period following Mr. Hartley's death an attempt was made to introduce an additional document into the probate process through a separate firm." He paused. "That document was received by this office 4 days ago." It purports to be a codicil to the original will dated 6 weeks prior to Mr. Hartley's death. Gerald removed a single sheet from his folder and set it flat on the table without passing it around. I have had this document examined by 2 independent specialists. Their findings are consistent. The signature on this document does not match the verified signature samples held on file for Arthur James Hartley. The paper stock and ink composition are inconsistent with documents from the stated date. This document is not authentic. The room was absolutely still. Margaret's face had gone the particular color of someone whose blood has stopped moving correctly. Daniel was staring at the table. One of my cousins made a small sound that was not quite a word. Gerald's voice did not rise. It did not need to. He said, "I am obligated to inform all parties that this finding has been referred to the relevant authorities this morning and that this office will cooperate fully with any subsequent investigation." He closed that particular page back into his folder. He said, "I will now proceed to the reading of the authenticated will of Arthur James Hartley." And then without any pause at all he said, "Would like to ask the executor of this estate to please confirm her presence." Every head in the room turned. I said, "I am here, Gerald." And I watched Margaret's face as 15 years of careful planning collapsed in a single sentence. Gerald read the will in full without stopping. His voice was steady and measured and he did not look up from the document except once, briefly, when he reached the section on the primary residential property. The Gloucestershire house, the 4 acres, the building that Margaret had been mentally redecorating for the better part of a decade, was left in its entirety to a charitable trust established in my grandfather's name, the income from which was to fund apprenticeships for young people entering the construction trades, a direct continuation of what Arthur Hartley had built his entire life around. It was not left to Daniel. It was not left to Margaret. It was not left to anyone sitting at that table. Margaret made a sound. It was not a word exactly, more the sound a person makes when something they believed was solid turns out to be air. Daniel pushed back slightly from the table and stared at the window. Gerald continued without acknowledging either of them. The investment portfolio was divided among all 6 grandchildren in equal shares. The commercial properties in Bristol and Bath were left to my mother and her sister jointly, with the instruction that they be managed cooperatively or sold by mutual agreement. There were specific personal bequests, items of furniture, books, a pocket watch that had belonged to my great-grandfather, directed to named individuals with careful reasoning noted beside each one. And then Gerald reached the final section. He said, "With respect to the role of executor, Mr. Hartley states the following, and I will read this passage in full as instructed." He cleared his throat. "I have appointed my granddaughter Eleanor Hartley as sole executor of this estate because she is the only person in my family who ever sat with me and asked how something was built rather than what it was worth. I trust her judgment completely. I trust her integrity without reservation. Everything that follows is in her hands." Gerald looked up. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when something true and irreversible has just been spoken aloud for the first time. What happened after Gerald finished reading is something I have replayed many times in the months since that Thursday morning. Not with satisfaction exactly, though I will not pretend there was none. More with a kind of clarity that only comes when something you have carried alone for a very long time is finally set down in a room full of witnesses. Margaret stood up before Gerald had fully closed his folder. Her voice was controlled but only just, the voice of a woman whose composure was load-bearing and beginning to crack under weight it was never designed to hold. She said this was wrong. She said grandfather had spoken to her personally about his intentions. She said there had been an understanding in the family for years about how things would be divided and that this document did not reflect what Arthur Hartley had actually wanted. She said the word actually as though emphasis alone could alter a legally binding instrument prepared by a qualified solicitor and witnessed by 2 independent parties 18 months before her father's death. Patrick opened his leather folder for the first time. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, the document Gerald has read today is the authenticated final will of Arthur Hartley. It supersedes all previous versions. It has been verified by this office and filed correctly with the probate registry." He paused. "With respect to the document submitted through the separate firm last week, I would strongly advise you and any parties connected to its preparation to seek independent legal counsel before making any further statements in this room. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the earlier silences. It was the silence of consequences becoming real. Daniel had not spoken once during the entire reading. He was looking at his hands. Rachel was looking at me. My mother was looking straight ahead with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between relief and grief and the particular exhaustion of a person who has known for a long time that a difficult thing was true and has finally been given permission to stop pretending otherwise. I drove home from Gerald's office that Thursday afternoon through the kind of grey Bristol drizzle that feels entirely appropriate when something enormous has just quietly ended. James was in the kitchen when I came through the door. He looked at my face and he did not ask how it went. He put the kettle on and he sat across from me at the kitchen table, and we stayed like that for a long time without speaking, because some things do not need words immediately, they need space first. The investigation into the forged codicil proceeded over the following months. I will not detail the legal specifics because they are still partially ongoing, but I will say that Margaret and Daniel both retained separate counsel and that neither of them has spoken to me directly since that Thursday morning. I do not lose sleep over that. The charitable trust was formally established 4 months after the reading. The first cohort of apprentices began their placements in the spring, 12 young people from Bristol and Gloucestershire learning a trade in a company that bears my grandfather's name. I attended the launch event on a Friday morning and stood in the back of the room and watched and thought about a man who had sat in a study on a Wednesday afternoon in August and slid an envelope across a desk to the one person he trusted completely. I thought about a 19-year-old girl who had chosen to ask questions instead of performing. I thought about 15 years of being overlooked and underestimated and smiled at with that particular smile. I am 37 years old. I am a solicitor based in Bristol. I have a husband who puts the kettle on without being asked and a grandfather who saw me clearly when no one else bothered to look. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen by the people who were supposed to love them first. I was lucky. I was chosen. Just not by who I expected. And it turned out that was more than enough.